but I thought it was pretty disgraceful by ESPN. Super Knicks bias. Just the whole, I don't know if you caught it, Stephen A. They showed him walking into the arena like he's a player, him doing a motivational speech with Spike Lee. I think it's one of those things where it's a fine line between being inside the NBA, where it's cool, it's funny, it's cutting edge, and where it's cringe like ESPN. It's a very fine line. I think they crossed the line there.
Welcome to another episode of In the Lab with Hoopsology. I'm your host, Matt Thomas, joined by my co-host, best friend, and as of today, car accident survivor. Hope you don't mind me saying, Justin. He's Justin Goodrum. Justin, stressful day, I know. Thanks for being with us. How you doing?
Doing good. Yeah, we're safe. And luckily minimal damage. So ready just to move on and focus on some basketball. How about yourself, man?
Right on. Well, thanks for playing hurt with us today. And I'm sincerely glad you guys are okay. I'm doing great. Just like we've been talking about tonight earlier with a guest that we had that you guys will be hearing about. There's just a lot going on in basketball right now with, of course, the W is in tip-off mode, but then NBA playoff action right in the thick of it. And yeah, we officially, as of last night, concluded the second round with the two games that were played. And as we'll discuss, it's pretty shocking what happened. So we'll get into that. Before we do, want to mention, if you are subscribed to our YouTube channel or podcast feed, you're already getting these great episodes. Share it with a friend who's interested in it. And we just want to say thank you, as always, for supporting the show, seeing, again, continual growth with the topics that we're posting and giving you guys aspects and views from all areas of the game of basketball and basketball culture. So thank you again, as always, for your support. Justin, the games are getting less and less. Now the series are getting less and less teams involved each round as we go and as teams get eliminated, but there's no shortage of things to talk about. I want to start by unpacking the second round and what went down since you and I last recorded. And no better place to start, I guess, than in Denver for Game 7, where at one point the Nuggets have a 20-point lead and then just kind of go ice cold, really, other than Nikola Jokic. Somewhat of a story of the series overall as you investigate the losses that happened for this Denver squad. And Minnesota impressively wins on the road in Game 7. Now, I want to touch on Minnesota more later in this episode, but give me your thoughts just on Denver. Are you as surprised as I am that they aren't repeating? We know that's very difficult, but this almost, to me, felt like a team of destiny that was going to do that. Are you surprised by what you've seen? Or is this really just, they were down 2 games early, and that was, I think, a bigger initial shock, and this is just the result of that?
Well, the series ping-ponged back and forth, a lot of blowouts, so it was really hard to get a beat on how this series is going to go. I think you saw ultimately just Minnesota just have the size and just their defensive prowess was just too much for the Nuggets. It's tough because it's kind of like you always take the incumbent. It's really hard just to pick a new kid on the block just to knock out the champs. So I was really hesitant to pick Minnesota, but they were really impressive. And really, Karl Anthony Towns was a huge difference maker. And really, that's the key. If he plays up to his potential, I really think they got a shot at winning the title. If he's up and down, kind of like what you saw with Jamal Murray, I think that's where things get fun, especially where we'll talk about the Mavericks and the Timberwolves. So to me, I think Cat is the big difference maker just in terms of how he can hit threes, his mobility. He's just super dangerous, and he really came up huge because Anthony Edwards did not play that well. He struggled. I think in the fourth quarter he was clutch, but in terms of the actual point production in a Game 7, he only scored 16 points. And as Kenny Smith said, if they were to lose, Ant would get a lot of the blame. He's not clutch, all the criticism, but they win and all of a sudden the narrative changes. So huge win for the Timberwolves. But in terms of the Nuggets, yeah, I am pretty surprised by this outcome.
Yeah, well said. You and I both picked Denver
Yeah.
at varying game amounts for this series, so we're both a little surprised by that. I think the Ant Edwards performance was kind of reminiscent of a Kobe Bryant game 7 in the finals when the
Mm.
Lakers beat the Celtics. Obviously an even greater stage being that it was the NBA finals, but similar kind of story. I think Anthony Edwards had a very impactful game on the defensive side of things. He had some great moments, like you mentioned, in the fourth quarter. But you're right. I mean, field goal wise, I think he was like 6 for 21 or something like that. Just really not an impressive looking night, which is why, to understand the full story, you really got to watch the games and not just take everything at face value on the box score. Regardless, Minnesota moving on. We'll talk about them. Let me ask you a little bit more about Denver. What do you think the chances are that, this year is kind of a fluke? They'll keep this core together, be back in the driver's seat. One thing they didn't have that they had last year, of course, in that title run was Bruce Brown and Jeff Green. I think they really missed them in this title run. And ultimately, the bench, they relied on some rookies and sophomores, Christian Brown and Peyton Watson. Ultimately, that's a lot to shoulder for a rookie or a second year player, even in that instance. Um, how are you feeling about their roster altogether? Are you buying like the heat on Michael Porter Jr., etc.? Do you what are you doing if you're their GM leading into this offseason?
I think I had to admit I kind of dismissed the whole notion about them having a lack of depth to their bench. So I think that's where it starts. In terms of the core, I think with Michael Porter Jr., I like him on this team. Definitely with Aaron Gordon, Jamal Murray, and of course the Joker. You keep them. That's the core. But I think the other positions are pretty expendable at this point in terms of strengthening just the bench. But the core is there. And I think at this era of the NBA, we discussed this era of like the super team in terms of getting like 5 All-Stars or whatever whatever big three, big two, whatever. I think that era is kind of gone, and I think the Nuggets are perfect for this era where really there is no power teams. Even with the Celtics, you can get even question if they really a super power team compared to kind of the old school teams of the past. So overall, I would say adding depth to their bench would be number one priority. But in terms of the core, I wouldn't mess with that formula.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. And it could really just be a matter of finding one player in the offseason that wants to sign
Yeah.
with this Denver team. It's an appealing place to play for obvious reasons, getting to play alongside Jokic. And then you see the rewards that Bruce Brown got to reap in the offseason following that. So you play with the Nuggets, maybe sign with them for 1 year at maybe a little bit less than you're worth. And then you might be gearing yourself up for a big payday
Yep.
if you're willing to take that risk. We'll come back to Denver a little bit more. I want to move through a little more of the series talks here before we wrap up the second round. Justin, you called this one, so I have to give you a lot of credit. I didn't really see this happening in Madison Square Garden initially when we were predicting this series, but it kind of felt like the Knicks were kind of like in old school cartoons, the car that's like rolling down the street and then all the pieces and parts start falling off as it's driving along. So like the tires are popping off and things like that. And then ultimately the body of the car, the doors of the car just fall off. It's kind of what this Knicks team felt like this postseason. We'll talk more about that, but give me your thoughts on the Pacers going into Madison Square Garden in game 7 and getting the job done. I mean, I think it was the first time in history that we've had 2 road game 7 wins in the second round.
Yeah, crazy, huh? A
Very
lot of
crazy.
thoughts, lots of thoughts on just the series and the coverage. So first, let's talk about the Knicks. Valiant effort. Props to the Knicks fans. I think I was surprised by their response at the end of the series. I don't know if you saw the Twitter clips, but them just the fans outside greeting Jalen Brunson, greeting Josh Hart, and then Brunson and Hart just dapping up the fans. I think that was an awesome moment. So a good look for Knicks fans, even though this was a heartbreaking loss. I agree with you, Matt. I think when picking this series, my heart, I really, really wanted to pick the Knicks, but they're just so decimated. And then you saw with Jalen Brunson, he fractured his hand. I mean, that's just game, set, match from there. And not to mention that I think the Pacers, I think Pascal Siakam has been fantastic. He
Yeah.
struggled against Milwaukee, but now it's really finding his groove. A huge pickup for them. Am I gonna? We'll talk about it later, but let's just say, do I like their chances of being a championship contender? No, I'll leave it at that for later. But in terms of this overall series, I just think the Knicks, the injuries caught up to them. I will point to the coverage of this series. I don't know how much of this game like you watched in terms of the post game, pre game, whatever halftime, but I thought it was pretty disgraceful by ESPN.
Mm.
Super Knicks bias. Just the whole, I don't know if you caught it. Stephen A. They showed him walking into the arena like he's a player, him doing a motivational speech with Spike Lee. I think it's one of those things where it's a fine line between being inside the NBA, where it's cool, it's funny, it's cutting edge, and where it's cringe like ESPN. It's a very fine line. I think they crossed the line there, just in terms of their
Mm.
bias, not even caring about the Indiana Pacers. I think Luka Andrews as a question just about the Pacers, and they totally ignored the Pacers, and they went to talk about the Knicks. Like, what are we doing here? I just think in terms of just being like having fun, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with Stephen A. having passion, no issue with that. But just disregarding the opponent of the Indiana Pacers, I think that's massively disrespectful. I think it hurts the game overall. So I was not happy with that. I know some other people on social media they were grabbing about that as well. I was in that camp. I was not happy to see that for sure.
Well, hey, and to your point, the NBA, this has been decades, at least a decade, that this has been a problem in
Yeah,
terms of having respect for Midwest teams. You look on the series we just talked about, and there were comments on Inside the NBA. Charles Barkley, who I love, said, I can't remember the last time I've been to Minnesota, like since I was a player.
you
Like
said 20 years. Yeah,
yeah, he said, I don't go to Minnesota. And, Anthony Edwards had some, some colorful remarks that he actually, I thought played it off pretty well and made light of it and everything. But, pretty disrespectful. And it seems like there is this sort of anti-Midwest thing in terms of with the NBA coverage. And it's a shame because there is great basketball history. There's some in Minnesota, but then certainly you think of Indiana and the history in that state with basketball. And I'm with you. I just don't understand. I get New York being the biggest market,
me too.
arguably.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a little bit more bias towards that coverage and maybe quite a bit more bias towards coverage there because you're trying to drive as many as ratings as you can. I get that. But when you have the Pacers come into Madison Square Garden and win that in Game 7, and the history of the rivalry between those two teams, and Reggie Miller being a big part of that, NBA history like this, even to an extent goes bigger than those regions alone. I agree with you. It's a bad look.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I thought it was pretty distasteful. And I think with the Inside the NBA, I get what you're saying, but I mean, it was a comment by Charles Barkley. He mentioned, hey, are there any good restaurants? I saw the local Minnesota news said, hey, Charles Barkley's looking for some restaurants here. Here's a couple. So I think there's a very fine line. I think ESPN just went way overboard.
Gotcha. Yeah. Looking at the Knicks, it seems like next year to me is going to be the year where they have to decide on Julius Randle and get something done. I don't think anyone would be shocked if that happens. It seems like now there's lots of whisperings about bringing Mikal Bridges in, if there's any package they can get together to fit him on that team. Going through that route, you'd have to assume they'd have to put up a little bit extra because you're essentially trading the player through the same city almost.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing him from the Nets to the Knicks. Probably a pretty tall order there. But it does seem to me like there's going to be a little bit of retooling happening with this team. It seems like this identity for the Knicks is working. What I want to ask you, Justin, and you're wearing the Bulls shirt right now. You watched Derrick Rose and those Bulls teams. Certainly, I remember watching those games with you.
Yeah.
Coach Thibodeau, it's come up again, and maybe it's beating an old drum that's been beat to death at this point. But with all the injuries and the way this team broke down that we talked about, I mean, we have kind of a built-up history. Do you think this is more a case of bad luck, or do you think the criticisms we're hearing on Coach Tibbs about overworking his players, playing too many minutes, do you think that's fair and that's kind of like a fatal flaw for him as a coach?
Well, when the drum has some sound that comes out of it, um, it still produces noise. So I think the criticism valid. And you take a look at just the injuries, like you mentioned with the Bulls that they went through. I mean, his track record. I mean, has he won an NBA title as a coach? No. And you take a
Not as a
look at
coach anyway.
as a head coach. Yeah, as the the front man of the team. Yeah, they play a lot of minutes, and I think he should be questioned for that. And it's going to be interesting because the Knicks, this era of the NBA, I think there is less of a ceiling to break through. So you have a lot of coaches that are available. I think they're going to make some hard choices in terms of where they go with the future of this franchise. And you mentioned Julius Randle too. I mean, we saw Jalen Brunson on his team. Can we deny that this guy is not a superstar? That he's not a borderline, or if not, an All NBA player?
Oh
Can you
yeah.
say the same thing about Julius Randle, like first team?
Not
Probably.
not the past 2 seasons at least.
Like I feel like in the NFL things can change. Some other sports, but when you see a player, you kind of know what they're gonna be, right? Like I don't. At this point, is Julius Randle going to carry his team to a championship? If he was on this squad, would they beat the Pacers? Possibly. I think so. It was a very, very close series. And I probably would have picked the Knicks against the Pacers if he was fully healthy. But against the Celtics, against the Timberwolves, against the Nuggets, probably not. And I think this team, they have a lot of hard choices they got to make. And you mentioned Bridges. I kind of say the same thing. I just think at this point, Brunson needs a lot of help. I think I like the core. I like OG. I like DiVincenzo. Like they have a lot of great supporting players. They just need that one more kind of missing piece to add. And I don't think Julius Randle's it.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do retooling next season. I'm sure we will talk about that a lot this offseason and look into that, keep our eyes on that. And I think it's worth circling back and repeating something that you already touched on, that I think this is certainly the most beloved Knicks team since that brief moment with Carmelo Anthony.
Agreed.
It's maybe the most beloved Knicks team since the Linsanity moment, which was a very short period in time, as we remember. And I think you could argue even this team is even more beloved than that squad, and maybe is the most beloved since that 99 team that made it to the NBA Finals without Patrick Ewing, that season with him being injured at the end there. So going to be exciting still to watch the Knicks, and they're going to be a factor next year. I don't know if it'll be up in the stratosphere of the second seed of the Eastern Conference, if other teams have more luck with health or building their rosters back up with, basically the avalanche that fell down with the roster changes we've seen to the Western Conference. But as always, we'll keep an eye on this. And hey, just props to you, man, for a gutsy call in picking the Pacers in 7. I am impressed by that. I don't know if everyone else is, but I am impressed with that pick.
I really want to pick the Knicks. I almost did. The injuries were just too much, but congratulations to the Pacers. A landmark win for a team that was not heavily picked to go to the Eastern Conference Finals. I'm almost positive by all the experts.
Well, let alone the playoffs.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there was certainly debate at the beginning of the year, and I'm glad you mentioned this because I did want to touch on this too. When we started the year, I mean, the Pacers have had a slow crescendo throughout the season. It was, okay, they'll be lucky to get a play-in tournament spot. And there was like, oh, Halliburton is doing some awesome stuff. They showed up for the in-season tournament. They were one of the headline teams there. I believe they were the team in the finals with the Lakers in the
Hmm.
in-season tournament. So they made some noise there. And then you get up all the way into where they skipped the play-in tournament and they got into that 6th seed spot, and they even shocked their opponents. Granted, injuries played a role in that too, but nonetheless, you play the games that are in front of you. And I think in part, having those low expectations from the start of the season, and also not knowing what to expect from Siakam's fit in this team
Yeah.
and where exactly he was in this moment of the season. And plus, we've seen Siakam both have success and failures in the postseason and recently even in the regular season. So it was interesting to see, and honestly uplifting to see him become a big factor in this series in New York, kind of sort of a redemption kind of arc on his career, kind of proving like, hey, this trade was well worth it for you guys to bring me here to Indiana this season.
No. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And you mentioned the in-season tournament. I think that's great, bodes well for the league, having the Pacers, be in the finals of that tournament, then going to the Eastern Conference Finals. A great commercial. I mean, if it was like the Spurs and like the Pistons, in the in-season tournament, the Pistons win. I mean, I don't think that'd be the greatest luck for that tournament. But instead, the Pacers going to the Eastern Conference Final. I think that is a great commercial for that tournament moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Builds up, a little prestige and value for that tournament. It's not just, something
Yeah.
that's a non-story. Um, Looking at the last series remaining here in the second round, um, maybe even I have to go back and say, I was talking about for several episodes, Denver versus Minnesota is going to be the best series. And really, I think I was mistaken there. It went 7 games. You and I talked about this earlier. They essentially traded blowouts for most of those games, which is not very entertaining, or at least as entertaining as it could have been. And certainly in the moment, I mean, it was very suspenseful, wondering who was going to win the series and make it out of all this. But in terms of like keeping you on the couch watching the games, when a team is down by like 20 points consistently, not as entertaining to watch as a television product. I think everyone would agree. What may have been a more entertaining series, the one we just talked about, the Knicks versus Pacers, which again is something that you said this will be one of the more entertaining series, if not the most entertaining series in the second round. I think that overall is correct. I think also Dallas versus OKC, you could
Yeah.
argue, was a little bit more entertaining, had a lot of the same elements of intensity, but less frequent blowouts. Anyway, long story short, Dallas takes the number 1 seed out in the Oklahoma City Thunder. Dallas eliminates them in 6 games. And I gotta, for one thing, I kind of like laid it hard on Luka in the last episode we
Mhm.
recorded. He had missed, a clutch free throw to tie that game up potentially, and they dropped that game in game 4. And then they came back and they won the next 2 games. Luka was fantastic. Kyrie, for the most part, was fantastic as well, and they got the job done. And they just kind of outclassed this OKC team. I think rebounding wound up being a fatal flaw for the Thunder, which I'm surprised I didn't remember quite as much, or harp on quite as much in our predictions. That was something that a lot of people were talking about throughout the season, that this is potentially the fatal flaw of this team. And it just so happened that came to fruition here against Dallas. I want to focus on OKC in the moment here, Justin. Just give me your thoughts on their season, where they are. It's a little bit of a disappointment in some ways because they were the 1 seed. Even though it maybe felt a little premature that they got there, it still is a 1 seed losing to a 5 seed. But how are you feeling about OKC? Because it seems in large part people are overwhelmingly positive about this team.
Yeah, I agree. And again, they like I mentioned in previous podcasts, um, teams that are set to be champions often go through a crucible and they have to battle a huge roadblocks. And I think the Thunder are no exception to that. I think they'll learn from this. Hopefully, if they're the competitors that I think a lot of the NBA thinks they are, it will drive them in the offseason. It sounds corny, but it's true. These losses affect a lot of teams in usually a positive manner where they come back stronger than ever. So the future is great. I don't think there's anything to be discouraged about. Maybe a little bit disappointed considering you're right, they are the one seed, but this I'd say a fantastic core. SGA is a superstar in this league and they got great players. And this is their planning and all their picks. This is their plan coming to fruition. Disappointing end, but nevertheless, the future is bright, and they're going to be a perennial top. I say 3 seed within the Western Conference for the future.
Yeah, hard to argue against that. And you think of those players and how well they played. I mean, you think of Chet's drive and
Yeah,
kind of ego, not in a bad sense, but his confidence, his swagger. I mean, you think that guy's not going to be working on adding to his game. I would say you're crazy if you think he's not going to be in the gym. Same thing with SGA. He's going to be bringing his game up as well. He was incredible in that game 6. I mean, keeping OKC around for that. It's hard to knock them because they are so young. So I'm with you. And on top of that, Presti has set them up well with picks and mobility in terms of if they need to bring in a vet, they can do that pretty easily with their enticing assets. If they need to make a free agent signing, they're going to have some cap room to work with as well. So it seems like they can go a lot of ways. And it seems like Presti, I mean, since the James Harden debacle back then, it seems like since that moment, overall, it almost feels like he doesn't make mistakes
yeah,
in terms of his decision making. Granted, I know a lot of people rip on the rebuilding strategy and these kind of like perpetual GMs, like, well, you can't fire me because my plan is underway. But when you see the payoff that he received this season, it justified, in my mind, all the questioning of Presti being one of those types of GMs. Like, yes, he was rebuilding, but he was doing it as intelligently as possible in the way this all went down, and they were able to secure the 1 seed as a result of that. So the future is bright in OKC. I wanted to ask you this question.
yeah.
I think I know my answer, but I want to hear yours first. Do you think it's more likely that we see Denver or Oklahoma City in the Western Conference Finals next year?
Whew, good question. I think I just trust the core of Denver. Just seeing, I mean, that's again, that is totally reasonable to say that is recency and local bias on my part. So, if people accuse me of that, that is probably true. But in all honesty, I really just like the Denver's core, their pedigree, and I think their ability to adapt in certain situations, even though I think they had a lot of weaknesses, as shown in their series against the Timberwolves. I would still favor the Nuggets to go to the conference finals. But I mean, it's not the downplay what the Thunder have done. I think it'll be close. But I just trust, unless we see some kind of a huge dip, unless Murray gets hurt or we see a huge decline, I still think the Nuggets are a perennial contender for kind of years to come. That it'll be probably most likely the Thunder have to go through in order to go to the conference finals. So I think that will be an interesting matchup.
Absolutely. And I'm 100% with you. I think, short and sweet, the Nuggets have Jokic
Yeah.
and Murray. And, Murray had an off series that has not been his typical lately the past couple of years. So I do think they're going to bounce back. And I think they have less volatility in having that core. I think they're the safer pick for that. All right, let's move forward into now analyzing our conference finals matchups here, and we can do some analysis of these teams that just won these series as well. If you like, you can take it whatever direction you want, Justin. But I want to talk about the Western Conference first. And like we said, the 1 seed is gone So Minnesota, as the 3 seed, has home court advantage in the Western Conference Finals. They are taking on Dallas, of course, who is the 5 seed. So we get a 3 seed versus a 5 seed. Kind of cool. I'll just go ahead and give my pick right off the bat, and we can get into some analysis and back and forth about this if you like. I think in terms of coaching, Coach Finch is a superior coach to Coach Kidd. Although kudos to Coach Kidd, this is a second Western Conference Finals in the last 4 years. That's impressive. That should be congratulated. Absolutely. But I think in terms of in-game adjustments, in terms of strategizing, I like the team that just beat the former champs. And I also think Dallas may have had somewhat of a size advantage or the ability to kind of bully the Oklahoma City Thunder in this last series. They don't have that advantage by any stretch of the imagination against the Minnesota Timberwolves, who were able to bully Jokic a little bit and the Denver Nuggets overall. So I think Dallas is in for a real gut check when this tips off in Minnesota and they start getting pushed around. And if it is still being allowed to be a pretty physical basketball game, this is going to feel a lot different to Dallas. For those reasons, I think on the Dallas side, you have arguably the best player right now that's still in the playoffs in Luka Doncic, at least on the offensive side of the ball. Anthony Edwards, being the competitive guy he is, he's going to want to prove me wrong in saying that. But that is one thing we can see. If Minnesota gets cold and Dallas is able to outscore them, they may have an advantage there. Overall, I see Minnesota taking this in 6 games. Justin, what do you make of that analysis and how do you see this playing out?
We're aligning this. I think just the size difference is going to be too much. Kyrie, even though he did have kind of a bad game in the previous series, did come up huge in the clincher. And I think that's something to take a look at in terms of, who are the most probably skilled players in terms of that superstar ability of being clutch. That's Luka and Kyrie. But the size, I think, is going to be the difference. I want to reference an article by the Oklahomian, but Justin Martinez, credit to him. He said, quote, Dallas' size advantage played a huge role in its series against OKC, but Minnesota has a more daunting front court. Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Naz Reid. The Mavericks defense has improved as of late, but the Timberwolves defense is deeper. Minnesota is the better team and has established itself as a legitimate title contender. They picked the Timberwolves in 6. I tend to agree with you, Matt, as well. I just don't see how the Mavericks win this series. And now I think the only way is just we see, and I think it's possible if we see Gobert and Cat just check out, which I wouldn't totally dismiss, but I just think their mindset is really together. I really think Chris Finch, unfortunately, him getting hurt, I think it's kind of rallied the team. I think that in a way that's kind of been a net positive. It's a bummer to see him get hurt, but just to overcome adversity is in a way teams kind of feed off of that. So overall, I think the stars are aligned for the Timberwolves to make it to the NBA Finals. Would be a huge accomplishment. I know A-Rod was pumped. He owns the team, so I know he was ecstatic talking to Anthony Edwards. He was in Denver too for them going to the Western Conference Finals. So yeah, I just don't see. I really think a slim chance for the Mavericks to really pull off the upset here.
Yeah, we'll see. And it's a huge test, arguably the biggest test that Luka Doncic has faced in his young career. If he's able to get through that defense and pull this off, huge feather in his cap. And conversely, if Anthony Edwards at his young age is able to make it to the NBA Finals, that's going to be very impressive as well. So either way you take this, someone's profile is being boosted big time by getting out of this series. Teams in their current formation, and Minnesota in a long while, or ever, historically have not seen them in the finals. Dallas, it's been a little while as well. So that's our Western Conference side. Let's move east. I think this is quite possibly the easier analysis, unless something pretty surprising happens here, at least in my opinion. But in the Eastern Conference, we have the 1 seed Boston Celtics, who, aside from an injury to Kristaps Porzingis that he is still recovering from, I believe last check I heard he's going to be missing at least the first 2 games of this series, and potentially the entire conference final series, as you and I mentioned previously, could be a possibility. The number 1 seed Boston Celtics taking on the number 6 seed Indiana Pacers, who we talked about earlier. And I'll be kind of short and sweet with this. This, again, I think should be kind of coasting for Boston. I think you can make a case this is an easier matchup than the Cleveland Cavaliers for the Boston Celtics. No disrespect intended to the Indiana Pacers. But aside from the unfortunate, injury and Donovan Mitchell sitting out at the end of the series, when the Cavs were full strength, they were, I think, more of a threat than this Pacers team. I just think Boston has so many options they can throw at them. I think Boston's strengths in their wing play with Tatum and Brown will present huge problems for the Pacers in trying to stop them. And I think as much as the Pacers like to push the pace and get down the court and be this high-powered offensive team, Boston is that team in the league right now who can match and who can even beat that if you're going to keep it a high-paced game. And even if it doesn't become a defensive struggle at all, the Celtics are equipped to play that way in that high-paced fashion. So I'm taking Boston in 5, and it wouldn't shock me if the Pacers win 2, just if it gets a little more competitive than I'm anticipating. But I'm expecting Boston in 5. How do you see this playing out, Justin?
Yeah, not looking good for the Indiana Pacers. An average of all the sports books based on Yahoo Sports has the Celtics as a negative 900 favorite, plus 600 for the Pacers to win. So heavy odds for the Pacers. Not much to add on this. It's a bad matchup for the Pacers. I mean, they barely get by the Knicks, and it's facing a perennial power within the Eastern Conference. The only teams that had a shot, I think, of beating the Celtics at full strength are out with Milwaukee and the Sixers. I think the Pacers get 1 game through a spectacular performance by Pascal Siakam. So I'll give them 1 game, but Boston in 5.
We are aligned on our conference picks. That kind of makes me nervous in a way, but I do think we have more and more history built up with all these teams.
Yeah.
So I'd be surprised if at least the teams that we picked didn't get through. That means, and in the Pacers' defense from our last analysis, I mean, not many teams match up well with the Boston Celtics. The 2 that come to mind would be Denver as well as Minnesota, who we discussed. I don't even know if the Mavericks match up super well against the Celtics. So I do like that we're predicting a Minnesota versus Boston finals. We'll think about that. And in a future episode, we'll give our thoughts on that prediction if that comes to fruition. Justin, anything you want to touch on before we sign out?
No, just check out our archive of past interviews on either a podcast feed or our YouTube feed as well. And if you have any questions or comments, we're available at hoopsologypod@gmail.com. If you want to gripe or complain or give us props, we'll take all of the feedback as well.
That's right. For Justin Goodrum, I'm Matt Thomas. Thanks as always for tuning in and supporting the show. Let us know your thoughts on our predictions and our analysis of those teams going out. Who do you think advances to the NBA Finals? Let us know. Take care. Peace out.
See you next time.